Hi everyone and welcome to an online lesson on the end of Cold War. By the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe and explain the reasons for the end of Cold War, the reasons for the dissolution of Soviet Union, and evaluate which is the most important reason that led to the end of the Cold War. So just a quick recap on what exactly is the Cold War. You'll see there's no direct fighting, there's clash of ideologies. Sometimes they fight this Cold War through the form of proxy war, where we have client states fighting on behalf of superpowers, as seen in the Korean War. They engage in arms race, there's lack of communication, and there's formation of two opposing blocs in Europe and in Asia. So let's define the end of Cold War. How do we know whether or not we have reached the end of Cold War is when we see better relations between the two superpowers. There's no more proxy wars or communist or democratic bloc. We see a significant reduction or even no more arms race. We see both sides communicating one another, as well as a lower threat of nuclear war. Most importantly, we see a death of one ideology, which means that literally there's no more clash of ideologies. So by 1990, all Eastern European states had broken away from the Soviet Union, as seen in this photo here. So you realize that with the death of ideologies, it means pretty much the death of communism and the victory of democracy, and later on, literally the dissolution of the USSR. So these are the 5 reasons for the end of the Cold War that we will be going through for today's lesson. The reasons are pretty much divided into long-term developments contributing to the end of Cold War versus short-term developments. So the first long-term development is the American economic and military superiority. In the 1970s, the USA's economy suffered a severe downturn due to two oil crises in the 1973 and 1979, as well as the great costs incurred in its involvement in the Vietnam War. To address the problem, Reagan began a process of economic liberalization where individual enterprise was encouraged instead of having the people rely too much on the government for goods and services. So for example, they cut national budgets, sold off national assets like phone companies, oil companies, and airlines. While controversial, this reform greatly restructured the economies of the Western Europe and the USA, stimulated economic growth, and launched a financial boom in the West during the 1980s. In addition, the economies of West Germany and Japan, the allies of the USA, had been growing after the success of the Marshall Plan. Their economic partnerships with the USA also contributed to the growth of the American economy during the 1980s. Now that there was a US economic recovery in the 1980s, this allowed a renewal of the arms race, which financially the Soviet Union was unable to match. The Soviet Union faced a great pressure to catch up with the United States. This is especially seen in the 1980s, where USA had a key military development called the SDI program, which was aimed to protect the world against the evil empire. So what exactly is the Strategic Defense Initiative, or more popularly known as the Star Wars program? This program aimed at developing new technologies such as satellites deployed in orbit around the Earth to detect and destroy any potential nuclear attack by intercontinental missiles. Although SDI was an expensive program, the USA was able to fund research more easily through its extensive financial network, which obviously the Soviet Union will not be able to keep up given its already stretched resources. The escalation of the arms race resulted in American-Soviet tensions reaching another peak when NATO decided to station over 100 Pershing II missiles in West Germany. Now, these nuclear missiles can be moved around easily and will aim at targets in the western part of the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union considered to be a threat due to their mobility and capacity for rapid deployment. In addition, the USA also held a 10-day joint military exercise with its NATO allies, and this was codenamed Able Archer 83. However, the exercise was so realistic that some members of the Soviet military and government believed that it preceded an actual nuclear-first strike on the Soviet Union by the USA and NATO. In response, the Soviets prepared their nuclear forces and put their Air Force units in East Germany and Poland on alert. As a result, the two superpowers once again faced the possibility of a nuclear war, very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So realize that America's economic and military superiority greatly pressured Soviet Union to seek for ways to achieve parity, but the internal conditions in Soviet Union largely prevented for it to happen because of its obligations to Warsaw Pact and in the Afghanistan war, which we will cover later. Hence, this forced Soviet Union to negotiate with US for military relaxation because the alternative was to increase military expenditures, and the Soviet economy really could not afford that. Okay, so let's talk about the events that occurring outside of Soviet Union. Another long-term development that led to the end of the Cold War was because of the stagnation of the Soviet economy due to Soviet's external economic burdens. While the US's economies improved in the mid-80s, partly with the help of its many trading partners, the Soviet Union found itself with economically weaker alliances. Due to its ideological commitment to its Eastern European satellite states, the Soviet Union supported poorer communist economies through economic bartering. So the Soviet Union's annual subsidy to its Warsaw allies through discounting of all prices amounted to about US 3 billion. And in addition, there's other external commitments as well, such as the decade-long Soviet-Afghan war, which also caused a huge drain on the Soviet Union in terms of money, resources, and also human casualties. So, because you must always remember, USA enjoyed the support of stronger allies like Britain, Germany, and Japan, but Soviet Union's allies were not really financially doing very well. So the Soviet Union found its allies to be a significant drain on its resources. So now that there's very little revenue left to produce consumer goods and infrastructure in Eastern Europe, the government's not appearing to be inefficient in managing the country as compared to their Western counterparts. Now this later on will leave a very strong will on the part of the citizens to have a change of government, which leads to a breakaway of the countries under the Warsaw Pact, which leads also to the end of two opposing blocs, leading to the end of the Cold War. The other issue that led to stagnation of the Soviet economy was the inherent problems with the Soviet command economy. You realize that on this table here are the features of the command economy and also the negative impacts on the economy itself. So pretty much you realize that yes, initially the Soviet economy was pretty much doing well in the early 1970s, but the Soviet economy actually began to stagnate from later on because of the flaws of the Soviet command economy. The main difference resided in how the resource allocation was decided. You realize that how the Soviet command economy worked pretty much lead to poor quality of information, poor quality of life, and they are not able to compete in a global market as compared to the US, who is following the free market economy. So on the slides, you'll be able to see the features as well as the impact of the free market economy on US economy itself. So what is the impact of the weak Soviet economy is that there's actually declining confidence in the Soviet communist system because the Soviet economy now was stagnating from the 1970s because of the inherent flaws of the Soviet command economy. So there's very poor quality information available for those who had to make decisions about the economy, and they're focusing more on quantity rather than quality. The Soviet Union was also affected by low morale among its workers. So as a result, the economy now is very poor. People are becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the communist government who do not seem to be able to adequately provide for its citizens. So now people are losing confidence in the communist system, and communism was starting to become even more unpopular. Not only that, the weak economy also meant that Soviet Union found it very difficult and a challenge to keep up with the arms race against the United States because they literally don't have money to keep funding. So let's talk about the events that are currently happening outside of Soviet Union, where we see increasing resistance in the Eastern European bloc. Now, we all know that the Soviet leadership have a fearsome reputation for crushing opposition. But at the same time, now there's growing discontent towards oppressive Soviet rule. So we see the Hungarian Revolution and the Prague Spring happening, but both were actually crushed by the Soviet Union. And this is especially because of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which justified Soviet intervention. The Brezhnev Doctrine pretty much stated that no country is allowed to leave the Warsaw Pact or threaten the cohesiveness of the Soviet bloc. However, this did not stop certain dissidents from speaking out against the communist leadership and becoming well known in both their countries and in the West. So we realized that even the allies, even the communist allies, were starting to be against the Brezhnev doctrine, starting to be against the Soviet Union itself. So what is the impact of the increasing resistance within the communist bloc? At this point of time, the Soviet government's commitment to the Warsaw Pact, as well as the 2 decades-long arms race, had resulted in a weakened economy, which means that it cannot keep up the USA, they also cannot meet the needs of its people. And at this point, people are starting to realize that there's very different ways of living. The stark contrast in ways of life led to rising opposition within the communist bloc. So yes, uprising discontent were crushed, but it did not stop dissidents from speaking out against the communist leadership, which eroded the image of Soviet leadership and its authority to rule. This unhappiness eventually resulted in many revolutions that led to the breakaway of states from Russia and her eventual disintegration. So how did the end of Soviet control over Eastern Europe actually happen is when Mikhail Gorbachev took over and initiated a change in Soviet foreign policy. First of all, within the Eastern European bloc, he realized that the Soviet economic conditions in 1980s did not permit for aggressive intervention anymore. So at this point, he decided that he will abandon Brezhnev Doctrine, which resulted in a collapse of the Eastern European bloc, because now by abandoning Brezhnev Doctrine, this means that if there's any form of opposition or any uprisings against the communist power, we will no longer see Soviet forces or Soviet tanks charging into the country. Now that there's no more Soviet tanks charging to crush any form of oppositions or dissidents, this led to surge in revolutions in Eastern Europe. So countries one after another started to revolt against the Soviet rule. So for example, we see this happening in Poland, where we see strikes, and then the communist government decide to hold free elections. We see this happening in East Germany, where they started to have protests calling for a new government. The Berlin Wall was torn down. Germany was later on reunified. We have Czechoslovakia, where they have anti-communist demonstrations, and the Communist Party announced that it will give up control, and later on they held their first free elections. Hungary allowed political parties to be reformed, and free elections were held, which was won by the Democratic Forum. In Romania, rebellion started, and later on there was free elections being held. In Bulgaria, the Communist Party gave up control, and later on they have their first free elections as well. So you realize that this loss of control was a result of the fall in confidence level. Citizens of satellite states became hopeful when resistance against Soviet rule was not dealt with harshly, and this was due to the fact that the Brezhnev Doctrine was abandoned. This later on led to the collapse of Eastern European regimes successively in 1989, and later on the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what is the impact of the loss of control? Is because it signified the disintegration of the communist bloc, which was the very symbol of the bipolarity of the Cold War. The end of Soviet Union meant that the democratic ideology was no longer fighting another bloc of power. So now the only dominant power left was America, or USA. So now we have covered the first 3 reasons for the end of Cold War. Now let's talk about the implementation and consequences of Gorbachev's reforms. Now we already know that internally, Soviet Union was having an inefficient economy, which affected the quality of life. It led to low standards of living. People were not productive, they were not competitive, there's literally no reason for them to work hard, there's also lack of consumer goods. So clearly, there was an urgent need to reform the economy in order to meet the people's needs and also maintain people's support. Unfortunately, the government was also inefficient because communism being communism means that there's no elections, there's no check and balances, positions were based on favoritism. So there's over centralization of control, there's corruption due to lack of check or balances, and because of the fact there's no elections, there's no oppositions, this led to a lack of people's voice or any form of alternative views. So Gorbachev decided that he needed to reform the country in terms of economic and make efforts to improve whatever that's happening in his country's politics. So he implemented two reforms, perestroika and glasnost. So why did he implement glasnost and perestroika? For glasnost, he wanted to address the declining communist support and to allow for more freedom for the people. For perestroika, he wanted to reform and restructure the economy and to reduce military spending. Glasnost, which means openness, essentially called for greater transparency, freedom of speech and expression. Gorbachev believed that the changes that he envisioned for the Soviet Union could only happen if the economic and social problems of the country were allowed to be discussed openly. So he wanted to give his supporters the permission to speak out and provide the space and opportunities to convince Soviet people that these reforms were necessary. He wanted to be open to new ideas and encourage suggestions and feedback, and hence decided to reduce censorship by allowing public debates and also allowing new revelations about Soviet history, and also increase freedom. So for example, for years, the Soviet government denied the existence of problems like poor housing, food shortages. It also suppressed very important information like classified activities in the past, like purges, Stalin's atrocities. Now, all of these were made public. And then we have perestroika, which means restructuring. Perestroika was a program for economic and political reforms which glasnost was meant to pave the way for. So perestroika basically allows economic restructuring. So now there's private ownership of small businesses in service, manufacturing and foreign trade sectors. He introduced a market economy where there's prices of goods and services to be set up by enterprises, and he decided to reduce military spending because Gorbachev was like, dude, we are spending too much on military spending, we need the money to focus and restructure our own economy. So what is the impact of glasnost? Now, the openness allowed by Gorbachev to release to the public included all this information that I talked about just now. In addition, previously censored media was also opened up to hear alternative opinions. So now there's greater flow of information on the West that's flowing into the Eastern Bloc. So as a result, people felt quite cheated. The image of ideal Soviet life fell apart. Citizens felt that, oh my god, I've been scammed. I've been misled by the Soviet government. They have been hiding all of these important truths from us, especially over like whatever was happening during Stalin's time. So now they become so disillusioned that they give up their support and look for new ways for independence. For perestroika, it didn't work because hardliners felt that Gorbachev was betraying Marxist teachings because of the fact that he introduced capitalist methods to solve serious economic problems caused by inefficiency. So in theory, his reforms would turn the Soviet economy around because perestroika by right should be solving the problem of inefficiency and waste. But it didn't work out because communist hardlines saw this as kind of betraying the ideas of socialism, so they sabotaged his efforts and made sure that it failed. The Soviet people suffered initially because subsidies were removed, leading to a sharp rise in prices of basic necessities. Soviet workers in state-owned factories that failed also suffered because they were retrenched. So now hardliners were very angry with Gorbachev also because he made huge cuts in military spending. They felt that he was jeopardizing the security of the Soviet Union. So perestroika, which by right was supposed to help revive the Soviet economy, was one of the reasons that actually hastened or speed up its demise because it caused the government to lose control over economic conditions. And to be honest, years of cover-up that was revealed under glasnost also had detrimental effect on communism as a state policy. So internally, glasnost and perestroika did not achieve their aims. It led instead, it led to people losing confidence in the government. It increased public outcry and criticisms against the Communist Party as well as Gorbachev itself, and also tarnished the image of the party because they were very insincere in their actions also. But externally, it actually improved relations with the US because now Reagan believed that this USSR is different from the USSR that I used to know. He wanted to work together more, and Gorbachev's reform actually reflected his willingness to accept political liberalization. So at this point, Reagan started to relax his attitude towards the Soviet Union. So, did Gorbachev contribute to the collapse of Soviet Union? Is a mix of yes and no. Yes is because his policies, he wasn't able to, he introduced his policies, he cannot manage the hardliners, and he could not manage the people's expectations. But I think it's also important for us to take note that Gorbachev pretty much inherited a failing country with bad economy, failing economy, a country that was led by weak leaders and bad policies, and also because people were expecting very immediate results. But because USSR was in such a bad shape, it's almost impossible to expect positive results immediately. So at the same time, not only internally, but Gorbachev also initiated a change in Soviet foreign policy with the US. Gorbachev also introduced new thinking that advocated the idea that global problems ought to be solved based on shared moral and ethical principles instead of conflict between capitalism and communism. So basically, Gorbachev wanted to cultivate friendly relations with the West, including Reagan. He also believed that the Eastern European states should be allowed to handle their political affairs without Soviet interference. That's why he decided to withdraw the Soviet troops from Afghanistan from May 1988. At the same time, he also increased in the frequency of conferences with Reagan. So you realize on the screen that they have met a couple of times. So together, these meetings between the leaders established goodwill that had been lacking after the abandonment of Dayton or all the previous past tensions that happened between two leaders. They also laid the groundwork for subsequent treaties and discussions on nuclear disarmament. So this is actually a very significant milestone. So the open and increased communications between Soviet Union and United States led to genuine improvements in relations between the two powers. It also spurred a greater level of cooperation and a firm reduction in the use of nuclear powers. At the same time, as spoken just now, Gorbachev was allowing greater freedom for each country's right to choose its political and economic system, and this was emphasized to the UN on 7 December 1988, where you realize that he pretty much stated that the Soviet Union will recognize the right of all people to determine their own political and economic system. There will be amendments to the Soviet Criminal Code to respect human rights, and there will be an end to barring foreign radio and television broadcasts in the Soviet Union. He actually committed to withdrawing Soviet troops from Eastern Europe and demobilization of Soviet troops. He stated that Soviet troops in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany will be purely defensive, and he said that he will continue putting in effort to create dialogues with the USA towards peace and nuclear disarmament. You realize that this is a great significant shift compared to how the previous Soviet Union leaders always used to do. So this de-ideologization of Soviet foreign policy actually improved the image of Soviet Union with the Western democratic countries, and we will see the positive improvement of relations between USSR and the US. However, this sparked the disintegration of Soviet influence in the Eastern Bloc because it signaled an end to the Brezhnev Doctrine, which pretty much states that there will no longer be any form of support or intervention of the Soviet forces in the Eastern Bloc. So this resulted in the collapse of communist regimes through popular revolutions throughout Eastern European countries, and also resulted in the end of the Cold War because of the collapse of Soviet Union as a superpower. Because after all, Reagan's SDI plan forced Gorbachev to admit that USSR could not keep up with the arms race, which is why Gorbachev decided to withdraw tanks from the communist nations in Eastern Europe and ended the 9-year war in Afghanistan. You realize he also made a lot of effort in meeting up with Reagan to actually to discuss about nuclear disarmament. So all these actions definitely show that USSR, Gorbachev's USSR, is very much different from the USSR that we used to know when we're learning about Cold War. So realize that, in keeping with Glasnost, Gorbachev announced that satellite states should be free to choose their own governments. So by loosening control, he's actually weakening communist governments in these places, which is then not surprising that the communist regimes in these countries started to collapse, because if you remember, they were already very unhappy with the communist regimes in the first place. So you will realize that in 1989, there's a surge of democratic revolution sweeping through the Eastern European communist states. And Gorbachev did not use Soviet military to stop this revolution, so he actually made through with his words. And later on, in November 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. So realize that in 1919, the Soviet states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared independence from the Soviet Union. And in 1991, the Soviet Union broke apart and 15 new nations were formed. So the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War, because you realize that there's no more communist bloc. So there's no more communist bloc, but what led to disintegration of the Soviet Union is because of the August coup, where the communist hardliners tried to overthrow Gorbachev. Yes, this ended in failure, but later on the Communist Party was suspended and subsequently banned. Keyword banned by Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia. So now Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union on 25th December 1991. So at this point, you realize that the communist bloc disintegrated. Communist parties or the communist regime were banned in Russia. So with this, the Cold War had come to an end with the dissolution of Soviet Union after Soviet Union, Belarus, and Ukraine signed the Belarus Accord. One of the last reason or last factor that led to the end of Cold War is the change in leadership. Gorbachev adopted a liberal and open approach and was willing to embrace political liberalization. So he took the first step to cultivate better relations with the West. Reagan, seeing this, changed his stance from being aggressive to rather conciliatory towards Soviet Union, and he acknowledged the need to reduce military competition. So both leaders came to a realization that cooperation between the two superpowers would benefit themselves more than harming their own respective countries' development. So we realized these are the photos to show that both sides were working one another to reduce Cold War tensions. So for example, in 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to end all medium-range ICBMs. So we realize that this is the reasons for the end of the Cold War. We see the end of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. We see the fall of the Berlin Wall. We see increased cooperation between the superpowers, and finally, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, leading to the end of the Cold War.